Every morning she stood on the dusty corner selling flowers to strangers, her hands rough, her smile gentle. One day, a quiet man stopped by, buying a single rose but asking nothing in return. To her, he was just another passerby lost in the crowd. But weeks later she awoke to whispers. The street had been sold overnight, and when she saw the man again, he wasn't holding a rose. He held the deed. He'd bought the whole street, just to keep her safe. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky over Belhaven hung pale and still, the next it tore open like something wounded. Rain fell hard and fast, drumming against the wooden awnings of the saloon, hammering the tin roof of the general store, until the whole street sang with it. Dust turned to mud in seconds. The hitching posts glistened. Lamplight from the windows stretched across the flooding street in long, wavering lines of gold and amber, broken only by the shadows of men running for cover. But she didn't run. Clara Wynne stood by her flower cart at the edge of the boardwalk, one hand gripping the worn handlebar, the other clutching a bouquet of wild violets to her chest. Water poured from the brim of her bonnet, soaking through the thin fabric of her shawl, but she didn't move. Her flowers were all she had. If she left them, they'd be ruined by morning. If she stayed, she'd be drenched to the bone. She stayed. The street emptied fast. Doors slammed shut. Voices faded behind walls. The rain came down harder, turning the world into a blur of gray and gold, and Clara felt the cold settle deep into her shoulders. Her fingers were numb around the stems. The violets trembled in her grip, petals dark with water. Then she saw him. A figure, moving through the downpour like a shadow given weight. Tall, steady. A long coat that hung heavy with rain, a hat pulled low over his face. He walked with a kind of quiet purpose that made the storm seem small, his boots splashing through the flooded street without hesitation. Clara's breath caught. He was coming toward her. She straightened, instinct pulling her shoulders back despite the cold. Strangers didn't buy flowers in the rain. Strangers didn't buy flowers at all, not in Belhaven. This was a town that had forgotten softness, forgotten beauty. Flowers were a luxury no one thought they needed. But he didn't stop walking. When he reached the edge of the boardwalk, he paused just long enough to lift his gaze. His eyes were dark beneath the brim of his hat, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. There were lines around them, deep and worn, like a man who'd spent years looking at things he wished he hadn't. How much? His voice was low, rough at the edges but not unkind. Clara blinked rain from her lashes. For all of them. Her heart stumbled. All. He gestured toward the cart. Roses, daisies, wildflowers bundled in twine, violets still cradled against her chest. Everything she'd gathered that week from the fields beyond town, everything she'd arranged with care, hoping someone, anyone, would see them and remember what it felt like to want something gentle. She swallowed. I don't know if... Name your price. The rain drummed louder. Somewhere down the street, a shutter banged loose in the wind. Clara's fingers tightened around the violets. She didn't know what to say, didn't know what to feel. Men didn't buy every flower on a cart. Men didn't stand in the rain and look at her like she was the only solid thing in a world coming apart. $2, she whispered. It was too much. She knew it was too much. But the words had already left her mouth. He reached into his coat. When his hand emerged, it held a small leather pouch. He opened it without ceremony, counted out coins with steady fingers, and placed them on the edge of her cart. The metal gleamed even in the rain. Silver, not copper. Far more than $2. Far more than she'd ever seen at once. Clara stared at the coins, then at him. I can't keep the change, but you stood in the rain for them. His voice softened, just barely. That's worth more than flowers. Before she could argue, before she could even find her breath again, he reached out and took the bouquets, one after another, gathering them into his arms with a care that didn't match the hard line of his jaw. He held them like they mattered, like they were fragile. Clara watched, frozen, as he turned and walked back into the storm. She wanted to call after him, wanted to ask his name, ask why, ask anything that would make sense of what had just happened. But her voice stayed locked in her throat, and all she could do was stand there, water streaming down her face, staring at the coins on her cart. When she finally looked up again, he was gone. Vanished into the rain like he'd never been there at all. Only the scent of cedar tobacco lingered in the air, faint and fleeting, already being washed away. The rain didn't stop until dawn. Clara had stayed awake through the night, sitting at the small table in her rented room above the seamstress shop, staring at the coins by candlelight. She'd counted them 3 times. 12 silver dollars. More money than she'd made in 2 months. Maybe 3. Her hands shook every time she touched them. She didn't know what to do. Didn't know what it meant. Men didn't give away money like that, not in Belhaven, not anywhere. There was always a reason, always a cost. But when she closed her eyes, all she saw was the way he'd held the flowers. Gentle, reverent, like they were something holy. By the time the sun rose, pale and watery through the clouds, Clara had made a decision. She would find him. She would return the extra money. It was the only thing that made sense, the only thing that felt right. She dressed quickly, tucking the coins into a small cloth pouch she tied to her belt. Her cart was still where she'd left it, damp but intact, and she wheeled it down to her usual spot near the general store. The street was quiet in the early morning, puddles reflecting the gray sky, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and wood. A few people passed. Mrs. Holloway, the grocer's wife, gave her a sharp look and whispered something to the woman beside her. Old Mr. Tibbs tipped his hat, but didn't meet her eyes. Clara felt the weight of their stares, felt the way suspicion clung to her like mud. Belhaven had never been kind to her. She'd arrived 2 years ago with nothing but a worn suitcase and a hope that had long since faded. The town didn't trust outsiders, didn't trust women who worked alone, didn't trust anyone who smiled when the world gave them nothing to smile about. But Clara had learned to survive it. She sold her flowers. She kept her head down. She didn't ask for more than she could carry. Until last night. By mid-morning, the whispers had grown louder. She could feel them crawling across her skin every time someone walked past. The baker's daughter pointed at her from across the street. 2 ranch hands stopped their conversation to stare. Even the banker, Mr. Crenshaw, paused on the boardwalk and looked at her with narrowed eyes, before disappearing into his office. Clara kept her hands busy, arranging the few flowers she'd managed to salvage from the rain. Daisies, mostly. A handful of roses that had survived the storm. Then she saw him again. He stood across the street, half hidden in the shadow of the hardware store's awning. Same coat, same hat, same stillness that made him seem like part of the landscape, something that had always been there and always would be. Their eyes met. Clara's breath hitched. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge her beyond that single steady gaze. But there was something in it, something quiet and deliberate, like he was making sure she was still there, still standing. Then he turned and walked away, boots echoing softly on the wet boardwalk. Clara watched him go, her heart beating too fast, her fingers gripping the edge of her cart. She didn't call out, didn't follow. But as he disappeared around the corner, she felt something shift inside her, something small and fragile, like a seed breaking open beneath the soil. The days that followed were strange. Clara went about her routine, gathering flowers from the fields at dawn, arranging them at her cart, selling what she could to the few people who still spoke to her. But everything felt different now. The town felt different. Or maybe it was just her. She couldn't stop thinking about him, the stranger, the man in the rain. She asked around, carefully, quietly. The innkeeper said a man matching that description had taken a room 3 days ago, paid in advance, kept to himself. The blacksmith had seen him once, passing through at dusk, said he walked like a soldier, or maybe a lawman, someone who'd seen too much and carried it all on his shoulders. But no one knew his name, and no one knew why he'd bought every flower on her cart. Clara tried to let it go, tried to focus on the work, on the flowers, on the simple rhythm of her days. But every time she turned a corner, every time she heard footsteps behind her, her heart leapt with the hope, the fear that it might be him. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of rust and gold, she found something waiting for her. A new board, smooth and sturdy, nailed across the broken section of the boardwalk where her cart usually sat. The wood was fresh, pale, still smelling of sawdust. Someone had repaired it. Someone had cared enough to fix the one piece of street she claimed as her own. Clara knelt beside it, running her fingers over the grain. Her throat tightened. When she looked up, she saw him again, standing at the far end of the street just beyond the reach of the lamplight, watching. This time, she didn't look away, and neither did he. Spring arrived slowly that year, like it was afraid of what it might find. The snow melted in quiet rivulets, carving paths through the muddy streets. The air warmed just enough to coax the first wildflowers from the hillsides. small bursts of yellow and white that dotted the brown grass like stars. Clara gathered them every morning, filling her cart with blooms that smelled of rain and earth and new beginnings. And the changes kept coming. A week after the boardwalk was repaired, the hitching post near her cart was replaced. The old one had been rotting for months, leaning at a dangerous angle, but no one had bothered to fix it. Now it stood straight and strong, iron rings polished to a dull shine. 2 days later, the alley behind the general store, where she often walked to gather water from the well, was cleared of debris. The broken crates and rusted tools that had cluttered it for years were gone, replaced by clean swept stone. Clara noticed. Of course she noticed, but she didn't say anything, didn't ask, because deep down, she already knew. It was him, the man in the rain, the stranger who'd bought her flowers and vanished into the storm. He was still here, still watching, still, somehow, protecting the small corner of the world where she lived. She didn't understand why, didn't know what she'd done to deserve it. But every time she saw a new repair, every time she found something fixed that had been broken for so long, she felt that same fragile thing inside her grow a little stronger. Hope. It was a dangerous thing in a town like Belhaven. A town that fed on bitterness and suspicion, where kindness was currency and trust was a luxury no one could afford. But Clara had learned to guard her hope carefully, to keep it hidden beneath the surface like a flame cupped against the wind, until the day she finally spoke to him again. It was late afternoon, the light slanting golden through the dust, when she saw him standing near the post office. He wasn't hiding this time, wasn't watching from the shadows. He stood in plain sight, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, gaze fixed on something down the street. Clara's heart beat faster. She left her cart, something she never did, and walked toward him. Her steps were careful, measured, like she was approaching something wild that might bolt at any sudden movement. When she was close enough to speak without shouting, she stopped. "Thank you." He turned his head slowly, eyes finding hers. There was no surprise in his expression. No question. Just that same quiet acknowledgement, like he'd been waiting for her to say it. For what? His voice was low, steady. Clara gestured back toward her cart, toward the street, toward everything that had changed in the past few weeks. For all of it. A pause, long and heavy. Then he shook his head just once. "Wasn't me. Yes, it was." Another pause. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. "You don't owe me anything," he said finally. "I know." Clara's voice was soft but firm, but I wanted to say it anyway. Something shifted in his expression, subtle, almost imperceptible. The hard line of his jaw softened. The weight in his eyes eased, just a fraction. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, thought he'd turn and walk away like he had before, leaving her with nothing but questions and the ghost of cedar smoke. But then he spoke. "Elias." A pause. "Elias Harrow." Clara nodded slowly, testing the name in her mind. It fit him. Solid. Quiet. A name that carried weight. "I'm Clara." "I know." Of course he did. They stood there for a moment longer, the silence between them, not uncomfortable but full of things neither of them knew how to say yet. Then Elias glanced past her, toward the western hills where the sun was beginning to sink. "Storm's coming tonight," he said quietly. "You should get inside before it hits." Clara followed his gaze. The sky was still clear, but she'd learned to trust the instincts of people who knew the land. "Will you?" He almost smiled. Almost. Eventually, she wanted to ask more, wanted to know where he'd come from, why he'd stayed, what he was running from or toward. But the way he held himself, guarded, careful, told her those answers would come in time, if they came at all. So instead, she just nodded. "Good night, Mr. Harrow." "Elias," he corrected gently. "Elias." She turned and walked back to her cart, feeling his eyes on her the whole way. When she reached it, she allowed herself one glance over her shoulder. He was still standing there, still watching, and for the first time in a long time, Clara didn't feel alone. The storm came, just like he'd said. It rolled in fast after sunset, thunder growling across the valley, lightning splitting the sky in jagged white lines. Clara sat in her room above the seamstress's shop, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, watching the world outside dissolve into darkness and water. But she wasn't afraid, because somewhere out there, in the storm, was a man who'd fixed the broken pieces of her world without asking for anything in return. A man who stood in the rain to make sure she wasn't alone. A man named Elias Harrow, who carried shadows in his eyes but still knew how to be gentle. And when morning came, when the storm finally passed and the sun broke through the clouds in soft golden rays, Clara stepped outside to find her cart exactly where she'd left it, dry, protected. Someone had covered it with canvas during the night. Tied it down carefully so the wind wouldn't rip it away. Clara pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the steady beat of her heart beneath her palm. Across the street, barely visible in the early morning light, a figure moved. Tall, steady, disappearing around the corner before she could call out. But she didn't need to. She knew. And that was enough. Outside, the world began to wake. Birds called from the eaves. The street glistened with yesterday's rain. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the sound echoed soft and lonely through the empty morning. Clara returned to her cart, to the flowers that had survived another storm, and began to arrange them with careful hands. Daisies first, then roses, then the wild violets she'd found growing by the creek, their petals the color of twilight. She worked slowly, letting the rhythm of it steady her, letting the quiet hope inside her bloom like the flowers she tended. Because Belhaven was changing, she could feel it, and maybe, just maybe, so was she. The rain left everything raw. Water still dripped from the eaves of the saloon, tapping out a slow rhythm on the boardwalk below. Puddles stretched across Main Street like broken mirrors, reflecting pieces of sky and cloud and the faces of people who passed without looking down. The air smelled clean, too clean, like the storm had stripped away more than just dust. Clara stood at her cart, arranging the morning's flowers with careful fingers. Daisies clustered on the left. Roses, pale pink and yellow, filled the center. Wild violets, always the violets, nested in small bundles along the right edge. She'd learned their language over the years, learned which blooms spoke to which hearts. The ranchers wanted something bright and simple. The widows preferred white. The travelers took whatever caught their eye, usually something they could press between the pages of a Bible. But this morning, no one stopped. People passed her cart like it was invisible, like she was invisible. Mrs. Holloway walked by with her basket, eyes fixed straight ahead, mouth pressed into a thin line. Two ranch hands crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her. Even young Timothy Foster, who usually lingered to stare at the roses, hurried past with his head down. Clara felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders, heavy, familiar. Belhaven had never been kind, but this was different. This was deliberate. She'd felt it building since the storm, since the stranger, since Elias had bought every flower on her cart and left her with more money than she knew what to do with. Word had spread fast, the way it always did in small towns. By the next morning, everyone knew. And by the morning after that, everyone had an opinion. She must have done something to earn it. A man doesn't give away money like that for nothing. There's always a price, always a reason. Clara had heard the whispers, caught the sharp glances, felt the way conversations stopped when she walked into the general store, then started again the moment she left. She'd tried to ignore it, tried to keep her head down and let the gossip burn itself out, but gossip in Belhaven didn't burn out. It spread like wildfire, feeding on suspicion and boredom, until there was nothing left but ash. She adjusted the violets, their stems slipping slightly in her damp fingers. A breeze moved down the street, carrying the scent of wet wood and distant pine. Somewhere a door opened and closed, footsteps, voices. Then the banker appeared. Mr. Crenshaw stepped out of his office across the street, adjusting his vest with sharp, precise movements. He was a thin man, all angles and edges, with a face that looked like it had been carved from something bitter. His eyes found Clara immediately, and he stopped. Just stopped, right there in the middle of the boardwalk, and stared at her with an expression that made her skin crawl. She looked away first. Always looked away first. But she could still feel his gaze, cold and assessing, weighing her worth and finding it wanting. When he finally moved on, Clara released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The morning dragged. She sold 3 bouquets, one to a traveling salesman who barely glanced at them, one to old Mr. Tibbs who paid in silence, and one to a young mother who counted out pennies with trembling hands and whispered an apology for not having more. Clara smiled at her, told her it was enough, told her the flowers would brighten her table, make her children smile. The woman's eyes had filled with tears, and she'd hurried away clutching the daisies like they were made of gold. Those moments were what Clara lived for, the small kindnesses, the brief connections, the reminder that not everyone in Belhaven had forgotten how to be gentle, but those moments were rare. By noon, the sun had burned through the clouds, turning the street into a patchwork of light and shadow. Heat rose from the damp earth, thick and humid, making Clara's dress cling to her skin. She was thinking about closing early, about retreating to the cool darkness of her room, when she heard it. Voices, raised, angry. She turned toward the sound. A crowd had gathered near the land office at the far end of the street. 20 people, maybe more, clustered in a tight knot around something, or someone. Clara couldn't see what, but she could hear the tension thrumming through the air like a plucked string. Curiosity pulled at her. She glanced at her cart, at the flowers wilting slightly in the heat, then back at the crowd. Against her better judgment, she left the cart and walked toward them. The voices grew louder as she approached. Fragments of sentences reached her through the noise. Bought the whole row, under false names. Nobody knows what he's planning. Clara's stomach tightened. She pushed her way to the edge of the crowd, careful not to draw attention, and finally saw who they were surrounding. Elias Harrow stood in the center of it all. He looked exactly as he had the last time she'd seen him. Tall, still, his hat pulled low, his coat dusty from the road. But there was something different about him now. Something harder. His jaw was set, his shoulders squared, and his hands hung loose at his sides like he was ready for whatever came next. Standing across from him was a man Clara didn't recognize. Older, maybe 50, with silver hair slicked back and a suit too fine for Belhaven. He held a leather satchel in one hand and a sheaf of papers in the other, waving them like weapons. "You can't deny it, Harrow." The man's voice was sharp, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "These documents prove it. You've been buying up property all over this town for the past 3 months, using shell companies, false identities. What are you trying to pull?" Elias didn't respond. His face remained impassive, carved from stone. The man stepped closer, emboldened by the silence. "The railroad's coming through here next year. Everyone knows it. And you're positioning yourself to make a fortune off these people's land." He gestured to the crowd. "You're a snake, Harrow. A goddamn snake." A ripple of anger moved through the onlookers. Someone spat. Someone else muttered a curse. Clara's heart was pounding. She wanted to move, wanted to speak, but her feet were rooted to the ground. Then Elias's eyes found hers. It was just a moment. A flicker of recognition across the space between them. But in that moment, Clara saw something she hadn't expected. Not guilt, not defiance. Exhaustion. He looked so tired. "Who is that?" Clara whispered to the woman beside her. "Thorne," the woman replied without looking away from the scene. "Land agent from the territorial office. Came in on the morning stage." Clara's chest tightened. She didn't know much about land agents, but she knew enough. They were the men who decided who kept their homes and who lost them. The men who turned people into numbers on a page. Thorne was still talking, his voice rising. "You think these people don't deserve to know the truth? You think you can just... I'm not taking anything from anyone." Elias's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Low, controlled, but edged with something dangerous. The crowd went silent. Thorne's smile was thin and cruel. "Then explain the deeds, Harrow. Explain why you own half this street and nobody even knew your name until last week. I don't owe you an explanation. No. But you owe them one." Thorne turned to the crowd, playing to them like a preacher at a revival. "This man is lying to you, using you, and when the railroad comes through, he'll be the only one left standing while the rest of you are..." That's enough. A new voice. Firm and familiar. Sheriff Dalton pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. He was an older man, graying at the temples, but his presence commanded respect. "Mr. Thorne, if you've got legal business with Mr. Harrow, you can take it up inside. But we're not doing this in the street." Thorne's expression soured. "The people have a right to know. The people have a right to go about their day without a mob forming in the middle of town." Dalton's tone left no room for argument. "Now move along. All of you." For a moment, no one moved. The tension hung thick and suffocating. Then slowly the crowd began to disperse, reluctant, muttering. But they moved. Thorne gathered his papers with sharp, angry movements. He shot Elias one last look, full of contempt and promise, before turning on his heel and striding toward the hotel. The sheriff lingered, his eyes on Elias. "You got somewhere to be, Harrow?" Elias nodded once. "Yes, sir." "Then I suggest you get there." Without another word, Elias turned and walked away. He moved through the remnants of the crowd like smoke, his shoulders hunched slightly against the stairs, his face unreadable. Clara watched him go, her heart still racing, her mind spinning with questions she didn't know how to ask. When he disappeared around the corner, she finally allowed herself to breathe. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Clara returned to her cart, but her thoughts were elsewhere, with Elias, with the accusations Thorne had thrown like stones, with the look on Elias's face when he'd seen her in the crowd, tired and alone and carrying something too heavy to name. By evening, the whispers had grown louder. She heard them in the general store when she bought flour, heard them on the steps of the church when she passed, heard them in the voices of children playing in the street, repeating words they'd heard from their parents. "He's a liar. He's a thief. He's going to ruin us all." And woven through it all, quieter but no less venomous, "She's with him. She must have known. Birds of a feather." Clara kept her head down, kept walking, kept breathing. But when she finally reached her room above the seamstress's shop, she closed the door behind her and sank onto the edge of her bed, her hands shaking. She didn't know what to believe, didn't know if the accusations were true or if Thorne was simply a man looking for someone to blame, didn't know if Elias was a liar or a victim or something in between. But she knew one thing. She'd seen his eyes. And whatever else he was, whatever he'd done, he wasn't a man without conscience. That had to mean something. Night fell heavy over Belhaven. Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep. Footsteps on the boardwalk below, the distant whinny of a horse, the low murmur of voices from the saloon. Then, just past midnight, she heard something else, a sound, faint but unmistakable, breaking glass. Clara sat up, her heart hammering. She moved to the window and looked down into the street. Her cart. Someone had thrown a rock through the lantern that hung from its side. Shards of glass glittered in the moonlight, scattered across the flowers like frost. The flame had gone out, leaving her corner of the street in darkness. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She pressed her hand against the window, her reflection staring back at her, pale and small and afraid. Below, a shadow moved, quick, deliberate, disappearing into the alley between the saloon and the feed store. She didn't go down, didn't call for help. What would she say? That someone had thrown a rock at her cart? That the town had finally turned its suspicion into action? No one would care. So she stood there, watching the glass shimmer in the moonlight, and felt the weight of Belhaven press down on her like a stone. Morning came cold and gray. Clara woke before dawn, exhausted but restless. She dressed quickly and went down to survey the damage. The glass had been swept away. Someone had done that in the night, though she didn't know who, and the cart itself was intact, but the flowers were bruised, some of them torn where the rock had struck. She picked through them carefully, salvaging what she could. Then she saw him. Elias stood at the end of the street, near the stable, watching her. He didn't approach, didn't wave, just stood there in the gray light, his face half shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. Clara straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. For a long moment they just looked at each other across the distance, two people caught in the crossfire of a town's judgment, neither of them sure what to do next. Then Elias turned and walked away, and Clara was alone again, surrounded by broken flowers and the cold silence of a street that had forgotten kindness. But as she knelt there, gathering the bruised petals into her hands, she made a decision. She didn't know if Elias was guilty or innocent. Didn't know if Thorne was telling the truth or spinning lies. Didn't know what the future held or how much darker things might get. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't going to run. Belhaven could whisper, could judge, could throw stones in the night, but she would still be here in the morning, selling her flowers, standing her ground, because if there was one thing Clara Wynne had learned in her years of surviving, it was that kindness didn't come from the world. It came from the choice to keep going when the world turned cold, and that was a choice she made every single day. The sun finally broke through the clouds just before noon, spilling pale gold across the wet street. Clara arranged the last of the salvaged flowers, daisies mostly, their petals still damp, and stepped back to look at her work. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And somewhere in this town, watching from the shadows, was a man who'd fixed the broken pieces of her world without asking for anything in return. Whatever came next, whatever storms still waited beyond the horizon, she wouldn't face them alone. Not anymore. The street stretched out before her, quiet and cold, but beneath the surface something was beginning to shift. Something small and stubborn and impossibly fragile. Hope. And this time, she wouldn't let anyone take it from her. Spring came slowly, like it was learning to trust again. The mornings arrived softer now, painted in shades of pink and gold that stretched across the valley floor. The frost retreated from the windowsills. The mud dried into pale dust that rose in gentle clouds whenever the wind picked up, and the wildflowers, the ones Clara had been waiting for all winter, finally began to bloom in earnest. She walked the fields at dawn, basket in hand, collecting them before the sun climbed too high. Yellow primrose grew near the creek bed, white columbine dotted the hillsides, and violets, always the violets, clustered in the shade of the cottonwoods, their petals dark and delicate like bruises healing into beauty. Clara moved through the grass with careful steps, her skirts damp from the dew, her fingers gentle as she cut each stem. This was the part of her day she loved most. Before the town woke, before the stares and whispers began, just her and the land and the quiet work of gathering what the earth offered freely. By the time she returned to Belhaven, the sun had crested the mountains, and the street was beginning to stir. Smoke rose from chimneys, doors opened, the blacksmith's hammer rang out its first notes of the day. Clara wheeled her cart into position near the general store, the same spot she'd claimed for 2 years now. The new board Elias had laid still gleamed pale beneath her wheels. She ran her hand across it briefly, a small gesture, private and deliberate, before beginning to arrange the flowers. Daisies on the left, roses in the center, violets along the right edge. The rhythm of it steadied her, made the world feel manageable. She was tying twine around a bundle of primrose when she noticed it, the cartwheel. The one that had been wobbling for weeks, threatening to collapse entirely every time she pushed the cart over uneven ground. The one she'd been trying to fix herself with strips of cloth and hope. It was repaired, not just patched, actually repaired. The old spokes had been replaced with new ones, clean and strong, and the iron rim had been hammered back into perfect alignment. The wheel turned smoothly now, without the grinding sound that had followed her everywhere. Clara crouched beside it, running her fingers over the wood. It was still damp with oil, freshly treated. This hadn't been done days ago. This had been done last night, while she slept. Her chest tightened. She straightened slowly, scanning the street. A few people moved about their morning routines. Mr. Tibbs sweeping his porch, Mrs. Holloway unlocking the door to her shop, 2 children chasing each other past the saloon. But no sign of him, no sign of Elias. Though she knew, with a certainty that lived somewhere deeper than logic, that he'd been here. That he'd knelt beside her cart in the darkness and fixed what was broken without waking her, without asking for thanks, without needing to be seen. Clara pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat against her palm. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty street. The wind carried her words away. The days unfurled like petals opening. Spring deepened. The trees along Main Street budded green. The air warmed enough that Clara could leave her shawl behind when she walked to the fields. And the town slowly, cautiously, began to soften, not toward Elias. The whispers about him hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd grown more elaborate, more tangled, each retelling adding new details until the truth was buried beneath layers of speculation. Some said he was a railroad spy. Others claimed he was a cattle baron hiding from debts back east. A few swore he'd killed a man in Denver and was using Belhaven as a place to disappear. But toward Clara, the cold shoulders began to thaw. It started small. Mrs. Perkins, the school teacher, stopped at her cart one morning and bought a bouquet of daisies without meeting Clara's eyes. She paid quickly, muttered something that might have been thank you, and hurried away. But it was something. Then old Mr. Tibbs began lingering when he passed, asking about her flowers, commenting on the weather. His voice was gruff, his manner awkward, but there was kindness beneath it. He'd always had a soft spot for things that grew, and Clara suspected he saw in her cart the same gentle stubbornness he cultivated in his own garden. Even the ranch hands, The ones who'd crossed the street to avoid her began nodding when they passed, not speaking, not yet, but acknowledging her presence like she was something other than invisible. Clara didn't trust it, not completely. She'd learned that towns like Belhaven turned with the wind, and today's kindness could be tomorrow's cruelty, depending on who said what to whom. But she accepted it, took it for what it was worth. Let it settle over her like sunshine, warm but uncertain, capable of disappearing behind clouds at any moment. And through it all, the small changes kept appearing. One morning, the post office wall, scarred with peeling paint and water damage, had been freshly whitewashed. The color was clean and bright, making the whole building look new again. A week later, the cobblestones near her cart were reset, the loose ones hammered back into place so they no longer shifted beneath her wheels. The water trough near the stable was scrubbed clean, the algae and rust scoured away until the metal gleamed. Each change was small, unremarkable on its own, but together they formed a pattern Clara couldn't ignore. Elias was still here, still watching, still tending to the broken pieces of Belhaven like they were his own. And he never asked for recognition. She saw him more frequently now, never up close, never in conversation, but he was there, moving through the edges of her days like a shadow that had learned to be gentle. She'd catch glimpses of him in the early morning, walking back from the livery with his coat dusty and his hat low, or standing outside the general store at dusk waiting for something or someone that never seemed to arrive. Once she saw him sitting on the bench outside the hotel, carving something from a piece of wood with slow, methodical strokes, his face unreadable in the fading light. He never approached her cart, never spoke to her in public, and Clara understood why. The town was watching, always watching, and any connection between them, any acknowledgement, would only feed the rumors, turn suspicion into certainty, and make both their lives harder than they already were. So they existed in parallel, two people moving through the same space, aware of each other but never touching, like stars that shared the same sky but never crossed paths. It should have felt lonely, but it didn't, because every repaired board, every reset stone, every small act of unseen kindness was a conversation they were having without words. A language built from care and attention, and the simple truth that someone was paying attention. And Clara had never felt more seen in her life. 3 weeks after the confrontation with Thorne, Clara made a decision. She would speak to him, find him, thank him properly instead of whispering gratitude to empty streets. It took her 2 days to work up the courage. She timed it carefully, waiting until late afternoon when the street was quiet and most people had retreated indoors to escape the heat. Then she left her cart, properly secured this time, with a sign that read back soon in her careful handwriting, and walked toward the inn. The innkeeper, a round woman named Mrs. Calloway, looked up when Clara entered. Her expression was neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. Progress, in its own way. "Can I help you, dear?" Clara's mouth was dry. "I'm looking for Mr. Harrow, Elias Harrow. I was told he's staying here?" Mrs. Calloway's eyebrows rose slightly. "He is. Room at the end of the hall upstairs. But I don't know if he's in. Keeps odd hours, that one." "May I?" The innkeeper studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Suit yourself. But if he's not there, don't go wandering." Clara nodded and climbed the narrow staircase, her heart beating too fast. The hallway was dim, lit only by a small window at the far end. 4 doors lined the walls, all closed. She found his room, last door on the right, and stood there for a moment, gathering her nerve. Then she knocked. Silence. She waited, counting her breaths. 5, 10, 15, nothing. Disappointment settled over her, heavy and familiar. She'd worked herself up for this, rehearsed what she'd say, and now... The door opened. Elias stood in the threshold, shirt untucked, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked like he'd just woken up, his hair disheveled, his face creased from where he'd been lying on something. But his eyes were clear, alert, focused entirely on her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Miss Wynne," his voice was rough with sleep. "Mr. Harrow." She hesitated. "Elias..." Something shifted in his expression, softened. "Is everything all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes. She twisted her hands together. "I wanted to thank you. For the cart, and the wheel, and the boardwalk, and everything else. I told you before. Wasn't me. And I told you I know it was..." A pause. long enough for Clara to hear the sound of voices drifting up from the saloon across the street. Laughter, glass clinking, the muffled notes of a piano. Then Elias stepped back slightly, a silent invitation. Clara glanced down the hallway, empty, and stepped inside. The room was small and sparse, a narrow bed against one wall, a table and chair near the window, a wash basin, a trunk at the foot of the bed with a coat draped over it. Nothing personal, nothing that suggested this was anything more than a temporary place to sleep. Elias closed the door but didn't latch it. Propriety, even in kindness. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "People will talk. They already talk. I know. That's why you shouldn't be here." Clara met his gaze. "I don't care what they say about me. Not anymore." Elias studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he moved to the window, looking out over the street. "You should. Words have weight in towns like this. They can break things that are already fragile. Then why are you still here?" The question hung between them, sharp and necessary. Elias didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, hands braced against the windowsill, shoulders tense beneath his shirt. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant. "Because I owe this place something." "What?" "A debt." He turned to face her. "A long time ago, Belhaven lost something because of decisions I was part of. I didn't pull the trigger, but I held the gun. And I can't undo that. Can't bring back what's gone, but I can." He trailed off, searching for words. "I can try to make sure it doesn't happen again." Clara took a step closer. "What happened?" Elias's jaw tightened. "That's not a story for today. Then when? Maybe never." The words should have stung, should have felt like rejection. But Clara heard the pain beneath them, the weight of things carried too long in silence. "All right," she said softly. "You don't have to tell me, but I want you to know something." He waited. "Whatever you did, whatever debt you think you owe, you've already paid it tenfold. The repairs, the kindness, the way you—" She gestured helplessly. "The way you see the things that are broken and fix them without needing credit, that's worth more than any debt." Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, "You give me too much credit, and you don't give yourself enough." Silence settled between them again. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that existed between people who understood each other, who didn't need to fill every moment with words. Finally, Elias spoke. "You should go, before someone notices." Clara nodded. She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the frame. "Will you come by the cart sometime? Not to buy anything, just to visit?" Elias's expression softened. "I'll think about it." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Clara allowed herself a small smile. "That's all I'm asking." She left before he could respond, descending the stairs quickly, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Behind her, she didn't see Elias return to the window, didn't see the way he watched her walk back to her cart, his hand pressed against the glass like he was reaching for something he couldn't quite touch. But she felt it, the way warmth lingered even after you stepped out of the sun. That evening, as Clara was closing up her cart, she found something tucked beneath one of the flower bundles. A small carved wooden bird. It was simple, unpolished, but the detail was extraordinary. Every feather had been etched with care. The wings were spread mid-flight, frozen in a moment of perfect freedom. Clara turned it over in her hands, her throat tight. She knew who'd made it. Knew he'd left it there while she'd been inside the inn, talking to Mrs. Calloway. Knew this was his way of answering her question. "Will you visit?" He already had. Clara tucked the bird into her apron pocket and finished closing the cart. The street was quiet now, the sun sinking low behind the mountains, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere in Belhaven, Elias Harrow was watching the same sunset, carrying the same silence, tending to the same broken pieces, and for the first time since the storm, Clara allowed herself to believe that broken things could heal, that people like them, damaged and judged and standing on the edges of acceptance, could still find something worth protecting, each other. The days continued to unfold, slow and steady. Clara sold her flowers. Elias moved through the town like a ghost with a conscience, and between them, in the spaces where words couldn't reach, something quiet and profound began to grow. Not love, not yet, but the soil for it, the sunlight, the rain, all the conditions necessary for something beautiful to take root. And in a town that had forgotten kindness, that was more than enough. It was everything. Outside, the evening deepened into twilight. Stars appeared one by one, scattered across the darkening sky like seeds waiting to bloom. The street settled into sleep, doors closing, lamps dimming, voices fading into the comfortable silence of another day survived. And in her room above the seamstress's shop, Clara sat by the window with the wooden bird in her hands, tracing the carved feathers with her fingertips. Tomorrow, she would return to the fields, gather more flowers, stand at her cart and wait for whatever the day brought. But tonight, she allowed herself this one small moment of peace, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, someone was watching over the things she loved, knowing that she wasn't alone anymore, and that, more than any bouquet, any coin, any word ever spoken, was the most precious gift she'd ever received, the gift of being seen and being worth protecting. The stagecoach arrived on a Tuesday. Clara heard it before she saw it. The thunder of hooves on packed earth, the rattle of wheels over stone, the driver's shout cutting through the afternoon air. She looked up from her flowers, shading her eyes against the sun, and watched as the coach rounded the bend and rolled into Belhaven trailing dust like a bridal veil. It wasn't unusual. The stage came through twice a week, bringing mail and supplies and the occasional traveler looking to pass through on their way to somewhere more important. But there was something different about this arrival, something that made the people on the street pause and turn, made conversations stop mid-sentence. Maybe it was the way the horses were lathered and wild-eyed, like they'd been pushed too hard for too long. Or maybe it was the man who stepped down before the coach had fully stopped, tall and severe in a black suit that looked like it had never seen dust, carrying a leather satchel that gleamed with newness and money. Thorne. Clara recognized him immediately, even though she'd only seen him once before. Some people carried their authority like a weapon, and Thorne was one of them. He moved with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no, who'd never had to ask twice for what he wanted. He scanned the street with cold, assessing eyes, and Clara felt her stomach tighten. He'd left 3 weeks ago after the confrontation with Elias. Sheriff Dalton had made it clear he wasn't welcome to stir up trouble, and Thorne had gone, but not quietly. He'd stood on the steps of the hotel and promised, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, that he'd be back, that the truth would come out, that justice, as he called it, would be served. Clara had hoped he'd been bluffing, but here he was, back, and carrying something that looked far too official to be ignored. Thorne adjusted his hat, brushed dust from his sleeves, and walked directly to the land office. The door opened before he reached it. Mr. Grady, the land agent, had been watching from the window, and the two men disappeared inside. The street remained quiet for a moment, waiting. Then the whispers started. Clara could hear them spreading like ripples in water, moving from person to person, shop to shop. She couldn't make out the words, but she didn't need to. She could read them in the faces around her, curiosity mixed with something darker, anticipation, the kind that came before a storm. She turned back to her flowers, trying to focus on the work, but her hands were shaking, and the stems kept slipping through her fingers. By evening, everyone knew. Thorne had returned with documentation, deeds, transaction records, legal papers that proved, according to him, that Elias Harrow had been systematically buying up property throughout Belhaven using false names and shell companies. Nearly half the commercial buildings on Main Street, several residential lots, even parcels of land outside town that most people didn't know were for sale. The accusations from before had been vague, built on suspicion and rumor, but this was different. This was evidence, paper and ink and official seals that couldn't be argued with. Clara heard it all secondhand, pieced together from fragments of conversation as people passed her cart. The ranch hands spoke of it in low, angry tones. The women whispered about it outside the general store. Even the children seemed to sense that something important was happening, their games quieter, their laughter subdued. And through it all, one question echoed louder than the rest. Why? Why would a stranger come to Belhaven and buy up half the town in secret? What was he planning? What did he want? The answers people invented were worse than the silence. He was working for the railroad, setting up a monopoly before the tracks came through. He was a land speculator, planning to evict everyone and sell at a profit. He was a con man, the advance scout for some larger scheme that would leave them all ruined. With every retelling, Elias became more of a monster, less of a man, and Clara felt the weight of it pressing down on her like a physical thing. She closed her cart early, while the sun was still high, and wheeled it back to the narrow alley beside the seamstress's shop. Her hands moved automatically, securing the wheels, covering the flowers with canvas, checking that everything was locked and safe. But her mind was elsewhere, with Elias. She hadn't seen him all day, hadn't caught even a glimpse of his shadow moving through the streets. And that absence felt louder than any presence. Where was he? Did he know Thorn was back? Did he know what was being said about him? Clara climbed the stairs to her room, each step heavier than the last. Inside, she lit a lamp against the gathering dusk and sat at the small table by the window. The wooden bird he'd carved sat there, next to a chipped cup and a vase of violets. She picked it up, running her thumb over the carved wings. She wanted to go to him, wanted to find him and ask if the accusations were true, if he really had bought all that property, if there was an explanation that made sense. But more than that, she wanted him to know she was still here. Still standing. Still willing to believe there was more to the story than what Thorn was selling. Outside, the street was painted gold with the last of the daylight. People moved about their evening routines, closing shops, heading home, gathering at the saloon. Everything looked normal, peaceful. But Clara could feel the tension thrumming beneath the surface, coiled tight and waiting. And she knew, with a certainty that made her chest ache, that this peace wouldn't last the night. The first stone came just after dark. Clara was lying in bed, not sleeping but trying to, when she heard the crash. Glass shattering, a shout, then running footsteps on the boardwalk below, rapid and chaotic. She bolted upright, heart pounding, and rushed to the window. The street was full of shadows and lamplight. A crowd had gathered near the land office, 30 people, maybe more, and they were angry. She could see it in the way they moved, in the harsh angles of their bodies. Someone was shouting, the words indistinct but venomous. Someone else threw something, another rock, and it struck the window of the office with a crack that echoed down the street. Clara's breath caught. Then she saw him. Elias stood in front of the land office door, shoulders squared, hands at his sides, facing the crowd alone. He wasn't shouting, wasn't arguing, just standing there like a wall between the mob and whatever they wanted to destroy. Sheriff Dalton appeared from the direction of the jailhouse, moving quickly despite his age, his hand on his pistol. "That's enough!" His voice cut through the noise like a whip. "Disperse. Now." "He's a thief!" someone shouted back. "He stole from us!" "He didn't steal anything," Dalton said firmly. "He bought property. That's not a crime. He lied about who he was. Using a business name isn't lying, it's legal. Now I won't say it again, go home." But the crowd didn't move. The anger had taken root too deep, fed by fear and uncertainty and the intoxicating feeling of righteousness. They wanted someone to blame, needed someone to blame. And Elias was right there, silent and stoic, an easy target for everything they couldn't control. Clara didn't think, didn't plan, she just moved. She threw a shawl over her nightgown, grabbed the lamp from her bedside table, and flew down the stairs. The seamstress's shop was dark and locked, but Clara knew where the spare key was kept. She fumbled with it, her hands clumsy with urgency, and finally got the door open. The street was chaos. More people had joined the crowd. Voices overlapped, shouting accusations and demands. Someone had brought a torch, actual fire, and the light danced across faces twisted with rage. Thorn stood at the edge of it all, watching, not participating, not stopping it, just watching with an expression that was equal part satisfaction and calculation. Clara pushed through the crowd, using her elbows when necessary, ignoring the hands that tried to pull her back. She could hear people saying her name, questioning what she was doing, but she didn't stop. She reached the front and stepped between Elias and the mob. The shouting faltered. Faces turned toward her, confusion replacing anger for just a moment. "Miss Wynne," Sheriff Dalton said, his voice tight with warning. "Step aside." Clara shook her head. Her lamp trembled in her grip, casting wild shadows. "No, Clara." Elias's voice, low and urgent behind her. "Don't do this." She didn't turn, didn't take her eyes off the crowd. "You want to throw stones? You want to burn something down because you're scared and angry and looking for someone to blame?" Her voice was shaking but steady. "Then you'll have to go through me first." Silence, heavy and stunned. Then someone in the back, Clara couldn't see who, laughed. A harsh, mocking sound. "You protecting him now? You know what he is?" "I know what you are," Clara shot back. "A mob. People who'd rather break things than ask questions. People who'd rather destroy a man than give him a chance to speak. "He's had chances," another voice shouted. "He won't explain himself. Maybe because he doesn't owe you an explanation." Clara's voice rose, carrying over the crowd. "Maybe because he's done nothing but help this town, and all you've done is judge him for it." "Help?" The word came from Thorne, who'd finally stepped forward. His voice was smooth, almost gentle, which made it more dangerous. "Is that what you call it, Miss Wynne? When a man secretly buys up half a town, that's helping?" Clara turned to face him. "Why don't you tell them the rest?" Thorne's smile didn't waver. The rest of what he bought. Not just buildings, land, outside town, land that nobody wanted because it's worthless for farming or grazing. Why would he buy that? "I don't claim to know his motives, but you're happy to let them assume the worst." Thorne's eyes hardened. "I'm here to protect these people from being exploited." "No," Clara said quietly. "You're here to exploit their fear, to turn them against each other so you can—" She stopped, the realization hitting her mid-sentence. "So you can buy the land yourself. When they're desperate enough to sell." The crowd stirred, murmurs of confusion, of doubt. Thorne's expression went cold. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Wynne. Then deny it." For the first time, Thorne had no ready answer. The silence stretched, and Clara saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, weighing risks, measuring outcomes, deciding how to regain control. Before he could speak, Elias stepped forward. "She's right." Every eye turned to him. Elias looked at the crowd, his face drawn but resolute. "Thorne works for a development company out of Denver. They're planning to buy up this entire valley once the railroad comes through. But they need the land cheap, so they send men like him ahead to create panic, make people think their property is worthless, or that holding on to it is dangerous. Then they swoop in with offers that sound generous but are a fraction of what the land will be worth in 5 years. The crowd was silent now, listening. "I bought that property," Elias continued, "because I knew what was coming. I bought it under different names because I didn't want Thorne, or the company he works for, to know someone was onto them. I bought it so that when the railroad arrives, the people of Belhaven will have options, will have leverage, will have a say in what happens to their town." He paused, his jaw tight. "I'm not a saint. I've made mistakes. I've done things I'm not proud of. But I didn't come here to exploit you. I came here to make sure you didn't get exploited the way." He stopped, something painful flickering across his face, the way other towns have been. The silence that followed was different, not angry, not certain, just heavy. The weight of people reassessing, recalculating, trying to figure out who to believe. Then Sheriff Dalton spoke. "Mr. Thorne, I think you should leave Belhaven." Thorne's face went red. "I have legal business. Your business is done, the land office is closed for the night, and I'm not inclined to let you stir up any more trouble." Dalton's hand moved to his pistol, not threatening, just present. "Stage leaves at dawn. I suggest you're on it." For a moment, Clara thought Thorne might argue, might push back with lawyers and legal documents and all the authority money could buy. But then he looked at the crowd, at the faces that were no longer quite as certain, no longer quite as angry, and seemed to realize he'd lost this round. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Then he turned and walked toward the hotel, his footsteps sharp and deliberate. The crowd began to disperse. Slowly at first, then faster, people drifting away in pairs and small groups, their voices low and uncertain. Within minutes, the street was empty except for Clara, Elias, and the sheriff. Dalton looked at Elias for a long moment. "You should have told me what you were doing. Would you have believed me?" "Probably not," Dalton sighed, "but it would have saved everyone a lot of trouble." He glanced at Clara. "You should get inside, Miss Wynne. It's late." Clara nodded but didn't move. Not yet. Dalton seemed to understand. He tipped his hat to both of them and walked back toward the jailhouse, his footsteps fading into the night. Finally, Clara and Elias were alone. They stood there in the empty street, lamplight pooling around them, the night air cool against Clara's skin. "You shouldn't have done that," Elias said quietly. "Done what?" "Stood in front of me. Put yourself between me and—" He gestured vaguely at where the crowd had been. "That—" Clara met his eyes. "Yes, I should have. They could have hurt you. They could have hurt you. I can take care of myself." "So can I." Elias looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then so quietly she almost didn't hear it. Why? Clara didn't have to ask what he meant. Because you fixed my cart. Because you repaired the boardwalk. Because you see the broken things and make them whole without needing credit or thanks or anything in return. She paused. And because, when I look at you, I don't see a liar or a thief or whatever they want to call you. I see someone who's trying to do right by a town that doesn't deserve it. Elias's jaw worked. You don't know me, Clara. I know enough. You know what I let you see. Then show me more. The words hung between them, fragile and brave. For a moment, Clara thought he might finally let her pass the walls he'd built so carefully. But then he shook his head, something sad and resigned crossing his face. Not tonight. Clara's chest tightened, but she nodded. All right. But Elias? He waited. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever comes next, whatever Thorn does, whatever the town thinks, I'm still going to be here, still standing. Elias looked at her like she'd just said something impossible, like she was a miracle he didn't know how to accept. You'll regret that, he said softly. Maybe. But it's my choice to make. They stood there a moment longer, the night pressing close around them. Then Clara turned and walked back to the seamstress's shop, her lamp casting long shadows on the ground. Behind her, Elias remained where he was. Watching, waiting, carrying the weight of everything he couldn't yet say. Clara didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed listening to the sounds of Belhaven settling back into uneasy rest. Doors closing, voices fading, the distant bark of a dog. But beneath it all, she could feel something shifting, not resolved, not yet, but changed. The town had seen both of them tonight. Seen Clara stand between Elias and the mob. Seen Elias explain himself, even when he didn't have to. Some people would remember that, would let it soften their judgment. But others would only remember that she'd chosen a side, that she'd put herself at risk for a man they still didn't trust. And in a town like Belhaven, that kind of choice had consequences. Clara pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat steady and strong beneath her palm. Let them talk, let them whisper, let them turn their backs if they wanted to. She'd made her choice, and she'd make it again. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and carrying the scent of distant rain. Clouds moved across the moon, turning the world into shifting patterns of light and shadow. And somewhere in that darkness, Elias Harrow sat in his rented room, staring at the wooden bird he'd carved but never given away, its twin to the one Clara kept, and wondered how someone like her could look at someone like him and still see something worth saving. He didn't have an answer, but for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wanted to find one, wanted to believe that redemption wasn't just something you worked toward alone in silence, that maybe, just maybe, it was something you could share with someone brave enough to stand beside you when the world turned dark. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, soft and hesitant against the window, Elias closed his eyes and let himself hope. Just for a moment, just enough to make it through another night. The rain never came. The clouds had gathered, dark and heavy with promise, but by morning they'd drifted east without releasing a single drop. The sky hung pale and exhausted, like something that had tried to weep and failed. Clara stood at her window watching the dawn break colorless over Belhaven, and felt that same emptiness settle into her bones. 3 days had passed since the confrontation. 3 days since she'd stood between Elias and the mob. 3 days since Thorn had left on the morning stage, his face tight with barely contained fury. His final words echoing in her memory, "This isn't over." He'd been right. The town had split cleanly down the middle, like an axe through wood. Half the people believed Elias's explanation, believed he'd been trying to protect them from land speculators and corporate greed. They nodded when Clara passed, offered quiet words of support, bought flowers from her cart with something that almost resembled respect. But the other half had hardened, turned cold, decided that Elias was still a liar, just a cleverer one, and that Clara was either his accomplice or his fool. They crossed the street when they saw her coming, stopped their children from lingering near her cart, whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "She's ruined herself for him, throwing her reputation away for a stranger. She'll regret it when he leaves." Clara had learned to let the words slide off her like water off oilcloth. She'd survived worse, would survive this too. But what worried her wasn't the gossip, it was Elias. She hadn't seen him in 3 days, not once, not even in the shadows at dusk where he usually appeared, watching over the street with that quiet vigilance that had become as familiar as breathing. His room at the inn was empty. Mrs. Calloway had told her as much, not unkindly, when Clara had finally worked up the courage to ask. He'd paid through the month, but hadn't been back since the night of the confrontation. His belongings were still there, his trunk, his coat, a few personal items, but the man himself had vanished. Clara told herself he'd needed space, needed time to think, needed distance from the town that had nearly torn him apart. But a small, frightened part of her whispered something darker. He's gone. He won't come back. You stood up for him and he left you to face it alone. She hated that voice, hated the doubt it seeded, but she couldn't silence it completely. So she did what she always did when the world felt too heavy. She went to the fields. The wildflowers were at their peak now, painting the hillsides in waves of color that made her chest ache with their beauty. Yellow blanket flower, purple lupine, white yarrow that swayed in the morning breeze like snow that had learned to dance. Clara moved through them with her basket and shears, cutting stems with careful precision. This was meditation. This was prayer. This was the only language she knew that made sense when everything else fell apart. She was crouched beside a cluster of columbine when she heard footsteps behind her. Her heart leapt. Elias, but when she turned, it wasn't him. It was Sheriff Dalton. He stood at the edge of the field, hat in hand, his face grave in the morning light. Something about his posture made Clara's stomach clench. "Miss Wynne," she straightened slowly, the shears still in her hand. "Sheriff, might I have a word?" Clara nodded, though her throat had gone tight. She set down her basket and walked toward him, her skirts brushing through the tall grass. When she was close enough to see the lines around his eyes, the weariness that seemed to have deepened overnight, she stopped. "Is something wrong?" Dalton was quiet for a moment, measuring his words. "I wanted to give you warning, fair warning, before you hear it from someone else." "Warning about what?" "About Harrow." He paused. "He came to see me last night. Told me he's leaving Bellhaven." The world tilted. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet, felt her breath catch and hold. "Says it's for the best. Says the town won't heal as long as he's here, and he doesn't want to cause more division." Dalton's voice was gentle, but it carried the weight of finality. "He's signing over all the property he bought. Deeds are being transferred to a trust managed by the land office. Mr. Grady will hold them until the railroad situation is resolved, then distribute them back to the original sellers at purchase price. No profit, no strings." Clara's hands were shaking. She clenched them at her sides. "When?" He didn't say, but I got the impression it would be soon. "Where is he now?" "I don't know." He didn't say that either. Dalton looked at her with something that might have been sympathy. "I'm sorry, Miss Wynne. I know you put yourself at risk for him, but maybe it's for the best. Maybe with him gone, things can go back to..." "To what?" Clara's voice came out sharper than she intended. "To the way they were? To a town that tears people apart based on rumor and fear? To a place where kindness is so rare that when someone shows it, we assume they're lying?" Dalton said nothing. Clara pressed her hand to her forehead, trying to steady herself. Did he? Did he say anything else? The sheriff hesitated. Then quietly he asked me to look after you. Said you'd stood up for him when no one else would, and that made you vulnerable. Made you a target. He met her eyes. "He cares about you, Miss Wynne. That's why he's leaving." The words should have been a comfort, should have felt like something precious. But all Clara felt was hollow. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice distant even to her own ears. Dalton put his hat back on, adjusting the brim. "For what it's worth, I think he's making a mistake, but I also think he's trying to do right by you. Sometimes those are the same thing." He turned and walked back toward town, leaving Clara alone in the field of wildflowers, the sky above her pale and empty as a promise broken. She didn't go back to her cart that day. Instead, she gathered flowers until her basket overflowed, until her hands were stained with sap and her shoulders ached from bending. She worked until the sun climbed high and hot, until the shadows shortened and the day pressed down on her like a weight she could barely carry. And she thought about Elias, about the way he'd stood in the rain to buy her flowers, about the boardwalk he'd repaired, the wheel he'd fixed, the small acts of invisible kindness that had mapped out his presence in her life. About the wooden bird on her windowsill, carved with such care it seemed to hold its breath. about the way he'd looked at her the night of the confrontation, like she was something impossible, something he didn't deserve. He's leaving because of me, she realized, because standing beside him put me in danger, and he can't bear the cost. The thought broke something inside her. Not anger, not betrayal, just a deep, aching sadness that felt like grief for something that had barely begun. When the sun finally started its descent, Clara made a decision. She wasn't going to let him leave without saying goodbye, without telling him that the cost was worth it, that she'd make the same choice again, consequences and all. She gathered her basket and walked back toward Belhaven, her steps purposeful despite the exhaustion that clung to her like cobwebs. She would find him, even if it meant searching every building, every alley, every corner of this God-forsaken town. She would find him and make him understand. But Belhaven had other plans. Clara was halfway down Main Street when she saw the crowd gathered outside the general store. Not a mob this time, something quieter, more somber. People clustered in small groups, their voices low, their faces tight with an emotion Clara couldn't quite name. Mrs. Perkins stood on the boardwalk, her hand pressed to her mouth. Mr. Tibbs leaned heavily on his cane, shaking his head slowly. Even the children were quiet, pressed against their mother's skirts, sensing that something important had happened. Clara's heart began to race. She approached Mrs. Perkins, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's happened?" The schoolteacher turned, her eyes red-rimmed. "Oh, Clara, it's terrible, just terrible. What is, your cart, someone—" She broke off, unable to finish. Clara didn't wait to hear more. She ran. Her basket fell forgotten in the street, flowers scattering across the dust. Her skirts tangled around her legs as she pushed through the crowd, her breath coming in sharp gasps. And then she saw it, her cart, or what was left of it. The wooden frame had been smashed, the boards splintered and scattered across the boardwalk. The wheels were broken, spokes snapped like bones. Every flower she'd left there that morning, the roses, the daisies, the carefully bundled violets, had been torn apart and trampled into the dirt, and painted across the remaining boards in crude, angry letters, Harrow's whore. Clara stopped. The world narrowed to that single moment, that single image, the violence of it, the cruelty. She felt people watching her, waiting for her reaction. Tears, rage, collapse. But Clara didn't give them any of it. She walked slowly to the wreckage, knelt down, and began gathering the broken flowers, one by one, stem by stem. Her hands were steady even though her heart was screaming. "Clara," a soft voice. Mrs. Calloway from the inn, crouching beside her. "Leave it. We'll help you clean up later. You don't have to." "Yes, I do. But—" "I do." Clara's voice was quiet but immovable. "Because if I don't, then they win. Whoever did this, whoever thought they could break me by breaking my flowers, they win. And I won't give them that." Mrs. Calloway was silent for a moment. Then slowly she began picking up flowers too. One by one, others joined. Mrs. Perkins, Mr. Tibbs, the young mother who'd bought daisies with pennies, even some of the ranch hands who'd been part of the mob 3 days ago. They worked in silence, gathering the destroyed blooms, stacking the broken boards, clearing away the evidence of hatred until all that remained was empty space and the ghost of what had been. When it was done, Clara stood and looked at the people around her. Some met her eyes, some didn't. But they were there, and that meant something. "Thank you," she said quietly. Then she turned and walked away, her shoulders straight, her head high, even though every step felt like walking through fire. She found him at the old church. It stood at the edge of town, half hidden by cottonwoods, its white paint peeling and its bell long since silenced. No one used it anymore. The congregation had moved to a newer building closer to the center of Belhaven. But the structure remained, a monument to something that used to matter. Elias sat on the steps, his back against the weathered door, his hat beside him. He looked up when Clara appeared through the trees and something flashed across his face. Relief, fear, guilt. Clara. She stopped a few feet away, suddenly unsure. All the words she'd rehearsed, all the things she'd planned to say, evaporated in the space between them. "I heard what happened," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. Are you?" The words came out sharper than she intended. Elias flinched. "Yes. Then why are you hiding here instead of—" Clara broke off, pressing her hand to her forehead. "I'm sorry. That wasn't fair." "It was." Elias stood slowly, his movements careful, like he was approaching something wounded. You have every right to be angry. I'm not angry at you. Clara met his eyes. I'm angry at whoever destroyed my cart. I'm angry at this town for forcing you to leave. I'm angry at... She gestured helplessly. All of it. I'm leaving because it's the right thing to do. For who? For you. For Belhaven. For... Don't. Clara's voice cracked. Don't tell me you're leaving for my sake. I didn't ask you to protect me by running away. You shouldn't have to ask. You shouldn't have to suffer because of my mistakes. What mistakes? Clara stepped closer, her hands clenched at her sides. Trying to help people? Trying to stop them from being exploited? Those aren't mistakes, Elias. Those are the reasons I stood beside you. You barely know me. I know you fixed my cart in the middle of the night. I know you repaired a boardwalk because you saw a woman standing in the rain trying to protect her flowers. I know you carved a wooden bird and left it for me like a promise. Her voice softened. I know enough. Elias looked at her for a long moment, something breaking behind his eyes. You don't know why I came here. You don't know what I've done. Then tell me, Clara, tell me. The silence stretched between them, taut as wire. Then Elias's shoulders sagged and he turned away, staring out at the trees. 10 years ago, he said quietly, I worked for the railroad, surveyor. My job was to map routes, assess land values, negotiate with property owners. He paused. There was a town called Broken Creek, small, smaller than Belhaven. The railroad wanted to route through their main valley and the company sent me to persuade the landowners to sell. Clara waited, her heart pounding. I knew the offers were too low, knew the company was lying about the land values, about what the route would do to their water supply, about everything. But I had my orders, and He stopped, his jaw tight. I did my job. I persuaded them. And 6 months after the railroad came through, Broken Creek was dying. The route had diverted their water. The company refused to compensate them. Half the town packed up and left, the other half. He shook his head. My sister lived there, married to a rancher. They lost everything. She died the following winter. Pneumonia. But really it was poverty. It was watching everything she'd built fall apart and not being able to stop it. Clara's throat tightened. By the time I realized what I'd been part of, it was too late. Broken Creek was already gone, scattered. And my sister. Elias's voice broke. My sister was buried in a grave I couldn't afford to mark properly. He turned back to Clara, and his eyes were raw with pain. That's who I am. That's what I did. I came to Belhaven because I heard the same company was planning to do it again, and I thought, he laughed bitterly, I thought I could stop it. Thought I could buy enough property to give people leverage, protect them from the same fate. But all I did was bring trouble to your door. Clara stared at him, seeing not the man she'd imagined, but someone more complicated, more broken, more human. You were wrong, she said finally. Elias blinked. What? About Broken Creek, about your sister. You were wrong to do what you did. She took a step closer. But you're trying to make it right. And that matters. It doesn't bring her back. No. But it might save someone else. It might save Belhaven. Clara reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and placed her hand on his arm. You can't undo the past, Elias. None of us can. But you can choose what to do now, and running away, leaving the people here to face Thorne and his company alone, that's not redemption. That's just more of the same. Elias looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. You're going to lose everything if you stand with me. I already did. My cart's destroyed. My reputation's in ruins. And you know what? Clara smiled, sad but genuine. I do it again. Because some things are worth the cost. Some people are worth fighting for. Clara. His voice was barely a whisper. Stay. She said it simply, directly. Stay and fight. Not alone. With me. With the people who believe you. With anyone who's willing to stand against the real thieves. She squeezed his arm gently. Stay. For a long moment, Elias didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there with Clara's hand on his arm and 10 years of guilt written across his face. Then slowly he nodded. All right. They walked back to town together as the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Clara's cart was gone. Mr. Tibbs and some of the ranch hands had hauled away the wreckage. But the space where it had stood remained. Empty. Waiting. I'll build you a new one, Elias said quietly. Better than the old one. Help. He glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face. You don't have to. I want to, Clara smiled. Besides, you'll probably build it too practical. It needs to be beautiful too. Elias almost smiled. Almost. Deal. They reached the seamstress's shop as full dark settled over Belhaven. Clara stopped at the door, suddenly uncertain about how to end this moment, how to say goodbye even temporarily after everything that had happened. But Elias solved it for her. I'll be at the carpentry shop tomorrow morning, he said. If you want to start on the cart, I'll be there. He nodded, then turned to leave. But Clara called after him. Elias? He stopped, looking back. Thank you for telling me about your sister. About Broken Creek. She paused. I know that wasn't easy. His expression softened. Neither was standing in front of a mob for a stranger. You're not a stranger anymore. Something passed between them then. Unspoken but understood. An acknowledgement that whatever this was, friendship, alliance, something deeper, it was real and worth protecting. Then Elias tipped his hat and disappeared into the darkness, his footsteps fading into the night. Clara climbed the stairs to her room, exhausted but lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying a weight she hadn't realized was there until it shifted. Inside, she lit a lamp and looked at the wooden bird on her windowsill. In the flickering light, it almost seemed to move, almost seemed to spread its wings and prepare for flight. But it stayed where it was, grounded, like her. Outside, the night deepened. Stars appeared one by one, cold and distant. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of earth and flowers and the faint promise of rain that might never come. And somewhere in Belhaven, a man who'd spent 10 years running finally allowed himself to stop, to stand still, to believe that maybe, just maybe, redemption wasn't something you earned alone in the dark, that maybe it was something you built with someone brave enough to stand beside you when everything fell apart, someone like Clara Wynne, who saw broken things and refused to look away, who chose mercy over safety, who paid the price gladly, and made it something beautiful. The heat came first, not from the sun, though it hung bloated and red on the horizon, too tired to climb higher, but from something else, something wrong. Clara woke to it at dawn, her room thick with warmth that pressed against her skin like fever. She sat up slowly, disoriented, and that's when she smelled it, smoke. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. She stumbled to the window and threw it open, and the sight that met her drove the breath from her lungs. Main Street was burning. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Flames climbed the side of the old granary at the far end of town, orange and gold and hungry. Black smoke poured into the pale morning sky, thick enough to blot out the sunrise, and in the street below people were running, shouting, chaos unfolding in the strange slow-motion clarity that came with disaster. Clara didn't think. She grabbed her shawl, shoved her feet into her boots without lacing them, and flew down the stairs. The street was pandemonium. Men carried buckets from the well, forming a chain that stretched toward the fire. Women shepherded children away from the flames, their faces tight with terror. Sheriff Dalton stood in the center of it all, directing people with sharp, urgent commands. The blacksmith was already on the granary roof, trying to beat back the flames with a wet blanket, but Clara could see it was a losing battle. The fire was spreading. She grabbed a bucket from the pile near the trough and joined the line, passing water hand to hand until her arms burned and her dress was soaked through. The heat was unbearable this close, a physical force that pushed against her chest and stole the air from her lungs. Back! Everyone back! The blacksmith's voice cut through the roar. It's going to collapse. The line broke and scattered as the granary's roof buckled with a sound like bones breaking. Sparks shot into the air, riding the smoke upward, and Clara watched in horror as they drifted toward the buildings on either side. The feed store, the printer's office, both wood frame structures that would go up like kindling. The wind's shifting, someone shouted. It's heading toward the residential side. Clara's blood went cold. The residential side meant the seamstress's shop, meant her room, meant everything she owned in the world. But more than that, it meant families, children, people who couldn't move fast enough to escape. She was turning to run back, to grab what she could when she saw him. Elias. He stood in the middle of the street, his shirt already dark with ash and sweat, but he wasn't running. He was looking at something, beyond the fire, his expression hard and focused. Then his eyes found Sheriff Dalton. This wasn't an accident. Elias's voice carried over the noise. Someone set this. Dalton was at his side in seconds. What are you talking about? Look at the pattern. Elias pointed to the granary, then to the feed store where flames had just begun to lick at the walls. They're not spreading naturally. Someone lit multiple points. And look, he gestured toward the opposite end of the street where smoke was rising from the land office. They're targeting specific buildings, the ones with the deed records. Clara's stomach dropped. Thorn, Dalton breathed. Has to be. He wants the records destroyed so no one can prove what Harrow bought. No deeds, no protection. Elias was already moving, running toward the land office. We have to get those documents out. Harrow, wait. But Elias didn't wait. He disappeared into the smoke, and Clara felt her heart lurch into her throat. She dropped her bucket and ran after him. The land office was an inferno. Flames covered the front of the building, crawling up the walls like living things. The windows had already blown out from the heat, and smoke poured from every opening. Clara could hear the fire inside, a deep roaring that sounded like rage-given voice. Elias stood at the door, his arm raised against the heat, trying to see inside. Elias, no! Clara grabbed his sleeve. You can't go in there. The deeds are in there. He turned to her, his face streaked with ash. Everything I bought, every piece of protection for this town, it's all in there. If Thorn destroys them, he wins. He can claim whatever he wants, and no one can prove otherwise. Then let them burn. It's not worth your life. It's the only thing that makes my life worth anything. The words hung between them for half a heartbeat. Then Elias tore his sleeve from her grip, pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth, and plunged into the burning building. No! Clara screamed, but he was already gone, swallowed by smoke and fire. She stood there frozen, her mind splitting between terror and decision. She could run for help, could get Dalton, No. She grabbed her shawl, soaked it in water from a nearby trough, wrapped it around her head and shoulders, and followed him in. The heat hit her like a wall, like stepping into an oven. She could barely breathe through the wet fabric, and the smoke was so thick she couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The building groaned around her, wood cracking and splitting under the stress. Elias! Her voice came out choked and thin. Clara? From somewhere deeper inside. Get out! Get out now! She moved toward his voice, one hand on the wall to guide her. The paint was bubbling under her palm, blistering from the heat. Her eyes streamed tears, and every breath tasted like ash and destruction. Then she saw him. He was at the back of the office, rifling through a filing cabinet with desperate speed, shoving documents into a leather satchel. Flames climbed the wall behind him, inches from his shoulders. Found them. He turned, saw her, and his face went white. What are you doing? What does it look like? You need to... The ceiling above them groaned. They both looked up in time to see a beam crack, splinter, and begin to fall. Elias lunged forward, wrapped his arms around Clara, and threw them both sideways. They hit the floor hard as the beam crashed down where they'd been standing, sending up a shower of sparks and burning debris. Clara couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Elias was on top of her, shielding her with his body, the satchel clutched between them. Can you move? His voice was rough, urgent. She nodded. Then move. Now! They scrambled to their feet, and Elias grabbed her hand. Together they ran for the door, stumbling over broken furniture and debris, the fire chasing them like something alive and vengeful. The heat was unbearable. Clara's lungs were screaming. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. Then they were outside, bursting into the street, gulping air that tasted like heaven despite the smoke. They collapsed to their knees, coughing violently, and Clara felt hands pulling at her shoulders. Sheriff Dalton, Mr. Tibbs, others whose names she couldn't remember through the haze. You goddamn fools! Dalton was shouting, but there was relief in his voice. You could have died in there! Elias held up the satchel, his hand shaking. The deeds, all of them. Dalton stared at him for a moment, then shook his head in something between admiration and disbelief. You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the stupidest. Maybe both. Behind them, the land office collapsed with a roar that shook the ground. The crowd gasped and scattered as flames shot higher, sparks raining down like hellfire. But they had the deeds. They had proof. And somewhere in Belhaven, someone was watching their plan fall apart. It took 4 hours to contain the fires. The granary was lost, nothing but a smoking shell. The land office was gone entirely. The feed store had been saved barely, though half its inventory was ruined. Several other buildings had sustained damage, and the entire town smelled like charcoal and defeat. But it could have been worse. So much worse. Clara sat on the edge of the water trough, her dress ruined, her face and hands blackened with soot. Mrs. Calloway had tried to get her to go inside, to rest, but Clara couldn't move, couldn't stop watching the smoke still rising from the ruins. Elias stood nearby, talking to Sheriff Dalton and Mr. Grady, the land agent. The satchel sat at their feet, its contents miraculously intact. Clara could see the tension in Elias's shoulders, the way his hands kept clenching and unclenching at his sides. Then Dalton looked up, his expression dark, and said something that made Elias go very still. The sheriff walked away quickly, heading toward the edge of town, and Elias turned to find Clara. Their eyes met across the distance, and she saw it immediately. Fear. He crossed to her in long strides and crouched down so they were eye level. They found something. What? Evidence. At the granary, someone saw 3 men leaving just before the fire started. And one of them. He hesitated. One of them was wearing a suit. City clothes, Thorne, maybe, or someone working for him. Elias's jaw tightened. Dalton's going to the hotel to question the guests. If Thorne's still in Belhaven, if he didn't actually leave on that stage. A gunshot cracked through the air. Everyone froze. The sound echoed off the buildings, sharp and final, coming from the direction of the hotel. Then voices, shouting, more gunfire. Elias was on his feet and running before Clara could react. She scrambled after him, her legs unsteady, her heart hammering. They reached the hotel just as Sheriff Dalton staggered out, his hand pressed to his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. "He's here!" Dalton gasped. Thorne, 2nd floor, armed. Elias caught him before he fell. "How many men?" "4. Maybe 5. "Where are they?" "Barricaded in the back room. They're—" Dalton grimaced in pain. "They're going to try to burn it, burn the hotel, destroy any evidence." Elias's face went hard. He eased Dalton down against the wall, then looked up at the hotel. Smoke was already beginning to seep from the 2nd floor windows. No. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. No, not again. But Elias was already standing, already checking the pistol at his hip. When had he gotten a pistol? And moving toward the entrance. Clara grabbed his arm. "Don't. Please, you already almost died once today." He looked at her, and his expression was gentle, resigned, like he'd known this moment was coming all along. "I have to finish this. You'll die. Maybe. But if I don't stop them, they'll burn this whole town to ash trying to cover their tracks." He placed his hand over hers, briefly, warmly. "Take care of the sheriff. And Clara?" She waited, tears burning in her eyes. "The cart we were going to build, make it beautiful, like you said." Then he pulled away and walked into the burning hotel. Clara would never be able to fully piece together what happened next. She heard gunfire, shouts, the sound of furniture breaking, more shots. So many she lost count. The smoke grew thicker, darker, and people began running from the hotel. Guests, staff, anyone who could move. Then silence, long, terrible, suffocating. The crowd gathered in the street, staring at the building as flames engulfed the 2nd floor. Someone was crying. Someone else was praying. Clara stood at the front, her fists clenched so tight her nails drew blood, and waited, waited, then movement, a figure in the doorway. Elias staggered out, his shirt burned and torn, his face black with soot. He had someone with him, dragging them really, a man in a ruined suit. Thorne. Elias made it 3 steps before his legs gave out. Clara was there before he hit the ground, her hands catching his shoulders, lowering him carefully. "I've got you. I've got you. The others." Elias's voice was a rasp, still inside. Couldn't get them out. "You got him. You got the one who mattered." Clara pressed her hand to his chest, feeling his heart beating too fast beneath her palm. "You did enough." Behind them, the hotel groaned and collapsed inward, flames shooting into the sky. But Thorne was in custody, coughing and cursing on the ground. And Elias was alive. Barely. But alive. Doc Brennan pushed through the crowd, his medical bag already open. "Get him to my office, now." They carried Elias through the streets of Belhaven, Clara on one side, Mr. Tibbs on the other, a dozen others helping where they could. The sun had finally climbed high, burning away the smoke, turning the ruins into stark monuments of what had almost been lost. But as they moved, Clara saw something else. The people of Belhaven, not whispering, not judging, but gathering, helping, bringing water, blankets, medical supplies, offering their homes to those who'd lost everything, working together in a way Clara had never seen before. The fire had burned more than buildings. It had burned away the division, the suspicion, the fear. And in its place, something new was growing. Elias woke 3 days later. Clara was sitting beside his bed in Doc Brennan's office when his eyes opened. She'd barely left his side, sleeping in a chair, refusing food more often than she accepted it. Clara. His voice was hoarse but clear. She leaned forward, relief flooding through her. Don't try to talk. You need to rest. Is it over? She nodded. Thorne's in jail. Federal marshals came from Denver. Turns out he and his company were wanted for fraud in 3 other territories. He's going away for a long time. She smiled, tired but genuine. The deeds you saved, they're being processed. Everyone's getting their property back, with full legal protection against predatory buying. Elias closed his eyes. Good. The town. Clara hesitated. The town wants to thank you. They're planning something. A ceremony or no. Elias, I don't need thanks. I just needed to make it right. He opened his eyes again, finding hers. Is your cart being built? Mr. Tibbs is overseeing it. He says it'll be the finest flower cart west of the Mississippi. She laughed softly. I think he's taking your make it beautiful instruction very seriously. Elias almost smiled. Almost. They sat in silence for a moment, the afternoon light streaming through the window, warm and golden. Outside, Clara could hear the sounds of rebuilding. Hammers, saws, voices calling to each other. Belhaven putting itself back together, board by board. I'm sorry, Elias said quietly. For what? For everything you lost. Your cart, your reputation, nearly your life. Clara reached out and took his hand. His skin was warm, rough with calluses and healing burns. I didn't lose anything that mattered, and I gained something I never expected. What? She squeezed his hand gently. Someone worth standing beside. Someone who reminded me that doing the right thing is never easy, but it's always worth it. She paused. Someone who sees broken things and refuses to walk away. Elias looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, softened. Like a weight he'd been carrying for 10 years finally began to lift. You're a remarkable woman, Clara Wynne, and you're a stubborn, self-sacrificing fool, Elias Harrow. She smiled. But you're my fool, and I'm not letting you run away again. Wasn't planning to. Good. Outside, the sound of hammering continued. The sound of a town healing. The sound of hope being rebuilt from ash and determination. And in that quiet room, with smoke still clinging to their clothes and burns still healing on their skin, 2 people who'd been broken by the world found something neither of them had been looking for. Each other. And the promise that sometimes, just sometimes, the things worth saving were the things you fought for together, no matter the cost. When the smoke finally cleared over Belhaven, when the last ember died and the stars emerged clear and bright, the town looked different, not just because of the damage, but because of what had been forged in the fire, a community that had remembered how to stand together, how to protect what mattered, how to choose mercy over judgment and courage over fear. And at the center of it all, 2 people who'd paid the price gladly, who'd walked through fire and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken, ready to build something new from the ashes, something beautiful, something worth every sacrifice they'd made and every scar they'd earned. Spring returned to Belhaven like a promise kept. The snow that had threatened all winter never came. Instead, the season arrived gently, almost shyly, as if unsure of its welcome. The cottonwoods budded green along the rebuilt section of Main Street. Wildflowers pushed through the scorched earth where the granary had stood, their colors impossibly bright against the dark soil, yellow and purple and white, like hope painted in petals. Clara stood in front of her new flower shop, hands on her hips, and felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Peace. The shop was small, just a single room with a workbench and shelves along the walls, but it was hers. Built where her cart used to stand, on the exact spot where she'd sold flowers for 2 years. Mr. Tibbs had overseen the construction personally, and true to his word, he'd made it beautiful. The wood was fresh and golden, still smelling of pine. The windows were large, letting in floods of morning light, and above the door, carved into a wooden sign that swung gently in the breeze, were the words, Clara's Blooms. She hadn't chosen the name. The town had. It had appeared one morning about a month after the fires, the sign already hung, the paint still wet. When she'd asked who was responsible, everyone had simply smiled and said it was a group effort. But Clara suspected Mr. Tibbs and Mrs. Calloway had been the ringleaders. The door behind her opened, and Elias stepped out, carrying a crate of fresh-cut stems. He moved carefully still. The burns on his arms and back had healed, but they'd left scars that pulled tight when he lifted heavy things. Doc Brennan said the stiffness would fade with time. Clara hoped he was right. "These go on the left?" Elias asked, holding up the crate. Clara turned and smiled. "The left, near the window so they get morning sun." He nodded and carried them inside. Clara watched him go, marveling at how natural this had become, how easily he'd settled into the rhythm of her days, helping with the flowers, building shelves when she needed them, sitting quietly in the corner on slow afternoons and carving small wooden figures that he left around the shop like secrets. He'd stayed. Not just in Belhaven, but with her. Not in any formal way. He still kept a room at the rebuilt boarding house, and propriety was observed as much as a small town demanded. But he was there every morning when she opened the shop, there every evening when she closed it, there in all the small moments in between, and Clara had stopped questioning it, stopped waiting for him to disappear. Because somewhere between the fires and the rebuilding, between standing together against the mob and nearly dying in burning buildings, they'd become something that didn't need defining. They were simply them, together. And that was enough. Clara! She turned to see young Timothy Foster running down the boardwalk, his face flushed with excitement. He skidded to a stop in front of her, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Miss Clara, Ma says to ask if you have any roses, pink ones, for the church social tomorrow." Clara smiled. "I do. Come inside and we'll pick some out." Timothy followed her into the shop, his eyes going wide the way they always did. He'd been fascinated by flowers since he was small, and Clara had started teaching him their names, their seasons, the best ways to keep them fresh. She suspected he'd make a fine gardener someday if the ranch life didn't claim him first. She was wrapping a bundle of pale pink roses in brown paper when the door opened again. Mrs. Perkins entered, followed by two of her students, young girls who giggled and whispered behind their hands. "Good morning, Clara," Mrs. Perkins said warmly. "The girls wanted to buy flowers for their mothers. It's their birthdays this week." "Of course." Clara gestured to the displays. "Take your time and choose whatever speaks to you." As the shop filled with quiet activity, Clara caught Elias watching from the back corner. He'd set down the wood he was carving and was simply observing, the children moving carefully among the flowers, Mrs. Perkins offering gentle guidance, sunlight streaming through the windows and turning everything golden. Their eyes met, and he smiled, small, private, just for her. Clara felt her chest warm. This was what they'd fought for, this quiet, ordinary beauty, this moment of peace in a world that had tried so hard to break them. The weeks unfolded like petals opening to sun. Belhaven had rebuilt faster than anyone expected. The hotel was nearly finished, grander than before, with a stone foundation that wouldn't burn. The land office had been reconstructed with fireproof safes and multiple copies of all deeds stored in different locations. Even the granary was being replaced, this time with better ventilation and modern equipment funded by a collective investment from the ranchers. But more than the buildings had changed. The people had changed. The division that had split, the town down the middle had softened, then dissolved entirely. People who'd once crossed the street to avoid each other now stopped to talk. Families who'd been feuding for years found common ground in the shared work of rebuilding, and Clara, who'd once been the subject of whispers and judgment, was now greeted with warmth wherever she went. It hadn't happened overnight. There were still a few who held on to their suspicions, who couldn't quite forgive Elias for being an outsider or Clara for standing beside him. But they were the minority now, and even they kept their opinions quiet, because everyone had seen what happened when the town turned on itself, had seen the destruction that came from choosing fear over trust, and no one wanted to go back to that darkness. Sheriff Dalton, his shoulder healed but his arm still in a sling, stopped by the shop one afternoon. He bought a bundle of wildflowers, "For my wife's grave," he said quietly, and lingered to talk. "Heard from the territorial marshal yesterday," he told Clara and Elias. "Thorne's trial is set for next month. They've got him on arson, attempted murder, fraud, conspiracy. He won't see daylight for 20 years, if ever." Elias nodded slowly. "And the company he worked for? Under investigation. Turns out Belhaven wasn't the only town they targeted. There are at least 6 others, including Broken Creek. Dalton glanced at Elias. Your testimony about what happened there is part of the case now. You might be called to Denver to speak. Something passed over Elias's face. Pain, but also something else. Resolution. I'll go, if it helps. It will. Dalton adjusted his hat. You did right by this town, Harrow. Both of you did. Don't think that's forgotten. After he left, Clara found Elias standing at the window, staring out at the street. She moved beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. You all right? She asked quietly. I don't know. He was silent for a moment. Going back to Broken Creek, even just to testify about it, that's going to be hard. I know, but I need to do it. Need to make sure what happened there doesn't happen again. He turned to look at her, and I was thinking, maybe you'd come with me, to Denver, if you want. Clara's heart skipped. You want me to come? I want. He stopped, searching for words. I don't want to do it alone, and you make hard things bearable. Clara took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. His palm was warm and rough, familiar now in ways that made her chest ache. Then I'll come. Of course I'll come. Relief flooded his expression. He squeezed her hand gently. Thank you. They stood there for a moment watching the street together, watching people move about their days, watching Belhaven live and breathe and grow. It's beautiful, isn't it? Clara said softly. What? This, all of it, what we built. Elias looked around the shop, at the flowers arranged in careful displays, at the sunlight streaming through the windows, at the small carved birds he'd scattered on the shelves. Then he looked at Clara. Yes, he said, it is. The church social was held on a Saturday in late spring. The whole town turned out. Families spread picnic blankets on the grass behind the church. Children ran wild among the cottonwoods, and someone had brought a fiddle that filled the air with music that made you want to dance, even if you didn't know how. Clara had closed the shop early to attend, and she'd brought arrangements for the tables, mason jars filled with wildflowers, simple but lovely. Elias had helped her carry them, and now he stood slightly apart from the main gathering, watching with that quiet intensity that never quite left him. Mrs. Calloway appeared at Clara's elbow, pressing a plate of food into her hands. You need to eat, dear. You're getting too thin. I eat plenty, Clara protested, but she accepted the plate anyway. And you, Mrs. Calloway turned to Elias. Stop lurking in the shadows like a ghost. Come sit with us. Elias looked uncomfortable, but Clara caught his eye and gestured to the blanket she'd spread under a tree. He hesitated, then moved to join them, lowering himself carefully to the ground. They ate in comfortable silence, watching the social unfold around them. Mr. Tibbs was telling stories to a group of children, his hands gesturing wildly. Mrs. Perkins was organizing a game of tag. Sheriff Dalton sat with his deputies, their laughter carrying across the grass. I never thought I'd see this, Elias said quietly. What? Clara asked. Belhaven. Happy. He shook his head. When I first arrived, this place felt like it was dying, like it had given up on itself. It had, Clara said. We all had, in our own ways. But sometimes it takes a fire to burn away the dead wood so new things can grow. That's very philosophical. I sell flowers for a living. Philosophy comes with the territory. She smiled. Besides, you're the one who started it. Fixing things no one asked you to fix. Caring about a town that didn't care about you. I had help. He looked at her, his expression soft. Couldn't have done it without you. We did it together. Yes. He said it simply. Certainly. We did. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest, and she had to look away before the emotion overwhelmed her. Instead, she watched the children playing, watched the families laughing, watched Belhaven being the town it was always meant to be. Then she felt Elias's hand cover hers, gentle, deliberate. She looked at him, and he was watching her with an expression she'd seen before, but never quite like this, open, unguarded. Clara, he said quietly, his voice nearly lost beneath the music and laughter. I need to tell you something. Her heart began to race. All right. He took a breath. I came to Belhaven to pay a debt, to make up for what I'd done wrong. And somewhere along the way, that debt became something else. He struggled, then started again. You stood beside me when no one else would. You walked into fire for me. You gave up everything you had because you believed I was worth saving. And He stopped, emotion tightening his throat. Clara waited, her hand warm beneath his. "I don't know if I deserve you," he continued. "Don't know if I ever will. But I know that when I think about the future, about what comes next, I can't imagine it without you. And I'm asking, if you'll have me, if you'll let me stay, not just in Belhaven, but with you, for as long as you'll let me." Clara's eyes burned with tears. "Elias Harrow, you damn fool." He blinked. "Is that a yes?" "Of course it's a yes," she laughed, the sound breaking slightly. "Did you really think I'd say anything else?" Relief flooded his face, and he smiled, genuinely smiled, in a way Clara had never quite seen before, like 10 years of weight had finally lifted, like he could finally breathe. "I love you," he said, simple, direct, true. "I love you too," Clara whispered. Around them the social continued, music and laughter and the sound of a town healing. But in that moment, beneath the cottonwood tree with spring sunlight filtering through the leaves, Clara and Elias existed in their own small world, a world they'd built from ashes and determination, from mercy and sacrifice, from the stubborn belief that broken things could be made whole if you were willing to fight for them. And as Elias leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away, Clara closed the distance between them and kissed him, soft, gentle, a promise sealed with something more precious than words. When they finally pulled apart, Mrs. Calloway was watching from across the grass with a knowing smile. She raised her glass of lemonade in a silent toast, and Clara couldn't help but laugh. "The whole town's going to know by sunset," she said. "Let them know." Elias's hand found hers again. "I'm done hiding. Me too." Summer arrived in full force, turning the valley gold. Clara's shop thrived. People came from neighboring towns to buy her flowers, drawn by word of mouth and the reputation she'd built for quality and care. She hired young Timothy Foster to help on weekends, teaching him the trade and watching with pride as he learned to arrange blooms with the same gentle precision she'd honed over years. Elias split his time between the shop and working with the town council. The property he'd bought, all of it, had been legally transferred into a community trust. Belhaven now owned its own future, protected from predatory developers and corporate schemes. He'd also started working with other towns, sharing what he'd learned, helping them organize against the same threats. The trip to Denver had been difficult. Testifying about Broken Creek had reopened old wounds, but Clara had been there beside him every step of the way. And when they'd visited his sister's grave afterward, when Elias had finally been able to afford a proper headstone, Clara had held his hand and let him grieve without words. They'd returned to Belhaven different, lighter, like they'd finally laid the past to rest and could move forward unburdened. One evening in late summer, as they were closing the shop together, Elias paused at the workbench. "I made you something," he said. Clara looked up from sweeping. "Another bird? Not exactly." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box no bigger than his palm. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every edge smooth, every corner perfectly fitted. Clara set down the broom and took the box carefully. "Elias, this is beautiful. Open it." She lifted the lid, and her breath caught. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a ring, simple, elegant, carved from the same golden wood as the box, with a small violet pressed into the surface and sealed beneath something clear and protective. "It's not gold," Elias said quickly. "Can't afford that yet. But I thought." Clara looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "It's perfect." Clara Wynne. He took the ring from the box with careful fingers. "I'm not a wealthy man. I can't give you grand houses or fancy things, but I can give you every day of my life. Every morning and every evening. Every moment I have left." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you marry me?" Clara's answer was immediate. "Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like he'd measured it 100 times to be sure. And then she was in his arms, laughing and crying at once, feeling more whole than she'd ever felt in her entire life. Outside, the sun set in shades of rose and amber. The street was quiet, peaceful, and through the window of Clara's blooms, anyone passing by could see two people holding each other like they'd found something worth more than gold. Each other. And a future they'd build together. The wedding was held in early autumn, when the cottonwoods turned gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and promise. The whole town attended. Mrs. Calloway cried through the entire ceremony. Mr. Tibbs gave Clara away, his voice gruff but proud. Sheriff Dalton stood as Elias's best man, a role he'd accepted with solemn honor. And when Clara and Elias exchanged vows beneath the sycamore tree behind the shop, the same tree that had shaded her cart for 2 years, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. "I promise to stand beside you," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "To see the broken things and help you mend them, to choose mercy over fear, to love you every day no matter what comes." "I promise to protect what you've built," Elias replied, "to be worthy of the faith you've placed in me, to never stop trying to be the man you see when you look at me, to love you until my last breath and beyond." The minister pronounced them married, and the crowd erupted in cheers. As they walked back down the aisle, if you could call the grass between the chairs an aisle, flowers rained down on them. Violets, roses, daisies. Every bloom Clara had ever sold, every flower she'd tended, returned to her in celebration. And behind the shop, where Elias's grave would one day rest, though neither of them knew it yet, the earth was rich and ready, waiting for the seeds that would bloom into remembrance and legacy, waiting for the story to complete itself. But that was years away, years of laughter and hard work, of children playing in the street, of flowers blooming and seasons turning, years of a town that had learned to choose kindness, a community that had remembered what it meant to stand together, years of love built from ashes. Clara woke on a spring morning 20 years later. The shop was exactly as she'd left it the night before, flowers arranged in careful displays, sunlight streaming through the windows, the scent of earth and blooms filling every corner. But something was different. She moved to the window and looked out at Main Street. The buildings had been painted recently, their colors bright and cheerful. The boardwalk had been widened, lined with planters that overflowed with flowers, petunias and marigolds and sweet william. Every window held pots of violets, their purple blooms nodding in the morning breeze. Belhaven had become exactly what they dreamed it could be. Place of beauty and kindness. A place where broken things were mended and outsiders were welcomed. A place that remembered. Clara's hand went to the wooden ring she still wore, though Elias had bought her a proper gold one years ago. She preferred this one. The violet inside had faded to a pale shadow, but she could still see it if she looked carefully. She walked through the shop, their shop, though Elias spent most of his time these days with the community trust office he'd established, and out the back door. The sycamore tree stood tall and strong, its branches spreading wide. Beneath it, surrounded by flowers, was a simple wooden marker. Not her marker, not yet, but Elias's. Elias Harrow, beloved husband, friend, protector. Kindness builds what gold cannot. He died peacefully 2 months ago, in his sleep, with Clara holding his hand. The whole town had mourned, had gathered to celebrate a life well lived, had planted this entire garden in his memory. Clara knelt beside the marker, her joints creaking slightly, and placed a fresh bouquet of violets against the wood. "Good morning," she whispered. "The shop's doing well. Timothy's running it mostly now. You'd be proud of him. And Sarah's granddaughter wants to apprentice. Says she wants to learn the trade." She smiled. "We're passing it on. Just like you wanted." The wind moved through the sycamore leaves, soft and gentle. "I miss you," Clara continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Every day. But I see you everywhere. In the flowers, in the children playing on the street you rebuilt, in every act of kindness this town offers to strangers." She touched the marker gently. "You made us better, made me better, and I'll spend every day I have left making sure that never gets forgotten." She sat there for a while longer, letting the morning sun warm her shoulders, letting the peace of the garden settle into her bones. Then she stood, brushed off her skirts, and walked back into the shop. There was work to do, flowers to arrange, people to serve, beauty to create, a legacy to honor. Years later, how many Clara could never quite remember, the town erected a proper monument, not just for Elias, but for both of them, for the story they'd written together in courage and sacrifice and stubborn, beautiful love. It stood in the center of Belhaven, where the land office used to be, a stone marker surrounded by an eternal garden, tended by volunteers who rotated seasons and never let it grow wild. The inscription was simple: Clara and Elias Harrow. She sold flowers to a stranger. He bought the whole street to protect her. Together they built a town that remembered kindness. And every spring, when the wildflowers bloomed and the air filled with the scent of renewal, Children would gather around the monument and ask their parents to tell them the story of the flower seller and the stranger, the story of fire and redemption, the story of two broken people who found each other and built something beautiful from the ashes. And every time the story was told, Belhaven bloomed a little brighter. Because some legacies aren't measured in gold or property or monuments, they're measured in the seeds you plant, the kindness you show, the way you choose mercy over judgment, courage over fear, love over everything else. They're measured in flowers that bloom year after year, generation after generation, in streets that remember what it means to be gentle, in towns that refuse to forget what two people sacrificed to save them, and in the quiet truth that love, real love, never dies. It just transforms, roots itself deep, and blooms eternal. And so Belhaven bloomed again, not from wealth or power, but from one man's quiet redemption and one woman's unwavering faith, from mercy given freely and sacrifice offered gladly, from love that chose to stand even when the world burned down around it. The street where Clara once sold flowers is now a garden that never fades, where children play among violets and roses, where strangers are welcomed and broken things are mended, where kindness built what gold never could. And where, on quiet spring mornings when the light slants just right, you can still catch the scent of cedar tobacco and wildflowers carried on the wind. A reminder, a promise, a legacy. That love, in its purest form, is never lost. It just keeps blooming.